Welcome to Quantum Voyager Stories, where science fiction touches the soul, and every story takes you somewhere you've never been, leaving something real behind. This is a story of choices, of an ancient world, Veyron IV, where memories are written not in words, but in the very breath of the planet. After awakening forces long sealed, Alyssa Tormin now walks a path few have seen, and fewer still have survived. With the echoes of Zarok's sacrifice still lingering, and the rift forever changed, this is not a tale of victory. It is a story of understanding, of listening when the stars fall silent, and of standing watch when no one else remains. Take a breath. The journey continues, and Veyron IV remembers. The wind had changed. Alyssa felt at the moment they stepped out from the narrow canyon path and into the clearing above the rift. It wasn't just a gust or a shift in temperature. It was the sense that something vast and unseen had stirred beneath the planet's surface. The rift was still there, a jagged scar across the earth, but it no longer felt dormant. It pulsed now, quietly, rhythmically, like the breath of something ancient waking from slumber. Around it, the very air shimmered faintly, as if charged with invisible static. Alyssa tightened the straps of her suit, her fingers brushing against the worn metal of her wrist module. She glanced at Zarok, who stood still beside her, eyes locked on the rift. "You feel that?" she asked, voice low. Zarok nodded, slowly. Veyron IV is no longer asleep. There was a gravity to his words that silenced her for a moment. The Karatha's voice wasn't shaken. It was reverent, almost respectful, like a priest entering sacred ground. They descended carefully, their boots crunching over loose stones and brittle crust. As they neared the edge, Alyssa could see faint veins of glowing light coursing through the rocks below, thin threads of energy pulsing with an internal rhythm, like the planet itself had veins, and now they were alive. The last time they had stood here, the rift had been quiet, mysterious, but still. Now, even the terrain looked different. Cracks had widened, and strange glyphs etched into the stone had begun to glow with a soft blue hue. The markings responded to their presence, pulsing gently, as if recognizing them. Alyssa's stomach twisted with unease. Zarok stepped forward and placed a hand near one of the glowing symbols. Not touching, just close enough that the energy responded, flickering more brightly. He closed his eyes briefly, brows furrowed, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "I don't like this," Alyssa whispered, more to herself than him. Zarok opened his eyes. "It's calling to us." "Calling," she repeated. He nodded. Not words, not even thoughts, just a presence. "It knows we're here." That did little to ease her nerves. She looked back at the rift, where the glow now deepened. A faint hum vibrated through the soles of her boots, and she realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her bones. A resonance. Something old. Something waking. Above them, the clouds twisted slowly, as if watching. She turned to Zarok again. "We started something, didn't we?" He didn't answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "No, we didn't start it. We just rang the bell." Alyssa stared into the rift's shimmering core. Whatever had been sleeping beneath Veyron IV, whatever had been waiting, was no longer silent. And somewhere deep below, it was listening. With every step Alyssa took along the fractured path, the ground beneath her boots responded, glowing softly, like embers awakening after a long winter. She slowed, watching as symbols etched into the surrounding stone flared to life, one after the other. They weren't just lighting up randomly. They followed her, each glyph flickering to a gentle glow as her foot landed nearby, then fading behind her like a trail of ancient stardust. Zarok walked just ahead, and the effect mirrored around him. The planet wasn't just reacting to one of them. It was reacting to both. "What is this?" she murmured, scanning the walls of the rift. The glyphs weren't familiar, not in shape, not in any linguistic way she understood, but they felt intentional. Each symbol curved and flowed, as if written in a language meant to be felt rather than read. Zarok's voice was hushed, reverent. "The path recognizes us." "Recognizes?" He nodded without turning. These marks were dormant for centuries, buried under dust, weathered by time. But they're alive now. As they moved deeper, the path widened, revealing a sprawling stone corridor carved into the rock. Along its edges, dozens, maybe hundreds, of those same symbols pulsed with faint blue light, syncing with their pace. And then, just as suddenly, the patterns began to shift. Alyssa stopped in her tracks. They're changing. Zarok turned, eyes narrowing. No, they're responding. In front of them, the symbols no longer follow their footsteps. Instead, they began aligning into shapes, forming patterns along the walls and floor. Spirals, arcs, geometric flows. And at the very center of the corridor, one massive symbol pulsed brighter than the rest, its shape unfamiliar, yet unmistakably important. A low hum filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it resonated, a subsonic tremor that settled into her chest. Alyssa stepped closer to the central glyph. The moment she did, it flared, casting rippling light across the stone corridor. Her breath caught in her throat. The air felt denser, like standing beneath a thunderstorm that hadn't yet broken. This place, she whispered. It's not just reacting, it's watching. Zarok stepped beside her, his eyes fixed on the central glyph. No, it's remembering. The glow continued to pulse, slower now, as if satisfied with their presence. And somewhere deeper within the rift, something stirred in response. The corridor narrowed into a chamber, vaulted stone ceilings carved with symbols, some half-worn, others glowing with a pale inner light. Alyssa stepped in cautiously, her boots echoing on the smooth, obsidian-like floor. The air was warmer here, charged with a kind of static energy that prickled against her skin. At the heart of the chamber stood a massive construct. It looked like a fusion of sculpture and technology, half organic, half machine. Tendrils of metal extended outward like frozen lightning, connecting to the walls and ceiling. Crystalline nodes pulsed gently along its spine, dim, but not dead. This is it, Zarok said, stepping forward slowly. The core. Alyssa eyed the construct. You're sure it won't explode if we touch it? Zarok didn't answer. He placed both palms onto a circular interface embedded into the side of the machine. The metal shifted subtly under his touch, like it remembered being touched long ago. A soft chime rang out. Then another. The room responded, glyphs along the walls beginning to pulse in a slow, deliberate rhythm. It's recognizing the activation pattern, Zarok said, his voice calm but focused. The sequence is still intact. Alyssa kept her eyes on the structure. Thin lines of light began spreading from the base of the machine, like rivers of energy waking from dormancy. They flowed outward into the floor, branching into the surrounding architecture like the roots of a long-buried tree suddenly fed by sunlight. As the energy spread, the hum returned, deeper now, resonating with the stone, the metal, even the air. Alyssa could feel it in her lungs. It wasn't threatening. It was alive. Zarok stepped back, exhaling slowly. We didn't just activate the machine. We reconnected it to the planet. Is that good or bad? That depends, he said, on what it remembers. From above, a faint glimmer sparked along the ceiling as a circular panel peeled open. A projection flickered into view, an array of ancient symbols rotating midair, slowly shifting between forms. It was language, but not just for reading. It was meant to be felt. Zarok watched the display, translating silently. His eyes widened. It's not just an interface. It's a beacon. Alyssa looked up at the projection, suddenly very aware that this machine might be doing more than waking up. It's sending a signal. Zarok nodded once. And something is listening. At first, Alyssa thought it was just a sound, like the faint hum of the machine growing louder, shifting pitch, forming patterns. But then she realized it wasn't coming through her ears. It was inside her mind. A voice. Not words, not exactly. It was older than language, deeper than thought, something ancient brushing against her consciousness, like the brush of wind through forgotten ruins. Yet somehow, it spoke to her. She froze, heart thudding her chest. Zarok turned sharply toward her, his eyes wide. You hear it too. She nodded slowly. It's in my head. The chamber around them pulsed with light, and the projections above swirled faster, as if reacting to their shared awareness. The voice wasn't aggressive. It didn't shout or demand. It simply was a presence vast and knowing, like the memory of a star whispering from a great distance. Then, unmistakably, a phrase formed. Not in English, not in Karathi, but they both understood it. The awakening has begun. Alyssa's breath caught. The words echoed through her, not in sound, but in meaning, weighted and final. "What do we do?" she whispered. Zarok didn't respond right away. His gaze had gone distant, as if he were listening to more than she could hear. After a moment, he said quietly, "We triggered the release protocol. Whatever was sleeping here, this machine wasn't just containment. It was communication." "Then what's it talking to?" Zarok's voice dropped. Something older than the machine itself. The room dimmed suddenly, the glowing symbols flickering like candlelight caught in a breeze. And then, just for a heartbeat, Alyssa felt watched. Not by Zarok, not by the machine, but by something vast and silent, observing them through layers of time. She shook off the chill, backing a step away from the core. "This was a warning, wasn't it?" she said. "That message, it wasn't for us. It was for whatever's down there." Zarok's expression was grim. Or both. The symbols pulsed once more, and then the light receded, leaving only a dim glow around the chamber's edges. The voice was gone, but its message remained, etched into the air, the stone, and their minds. The awakening wasn't a moment. It was already happening. The chamber fell into a tense silence. The light that once danced through the glyphs now dimmed to a faint, pulsing blue, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Zarok stepped forward, eyes fixed on the central projection. The symbols had slowed their rotation, rearranging into a new configuration, more jagged now, more urgent. He stared for a long moment, lips moving in silent translation. Alyssa approached slowly. "What is it?" Zarok didn't look at her. "It's a failsafe or a record?" "I'm not sure." He reached out and touched one of the floating glyphs. The moment his finger passed through it, the air cracked with static, and a new voice echoed through the chamber. This one wasn't soft. It was fractured, glitching at the edges, as if pulled from a dying memory. But the warning within it rang clear. Containment breach. Protocol sequence failed. Dormant force, unstable. Immediate isolation required. Alyssa felt her spine go cold. She turned to Zarok, who looked just as shaken. "They tried to seal it," he said, voice low. "They built all this not to preserve something, but to bury it. But we opened it." Zarok gave a slow, haunted nod. Another projection bloomed into view, this one more visual. It showed what looked like a swirling mass of energy, dark and shifting, sealed beneath layers of geometric structures. Tendrils reached outward from it, clawing at its prison. A phrase appeared in bold, ancient script. "Do not commune. Do not remember." Alyssa stared at the words. Her heart thudded against her ribs, the meaning all too clear. This wasn't a warning to outsiders. It was a desperate message from a dying civilization to itself. They had built this vault out of fear. They had buried a part of their own past. And now she and Zarok had pried the lid off. The machine pulsed one last time, then went still. The lights faded into a low glow. Silence returned. But something had changed. The hum beneath their feet felt different now. Less mechanical, more alive. Zarok finally spoke. "It's awake." Alyssa didn't respond. She was staring into the depths of the rift, where a faint red shimmer now pulsed, deep below the stone, like a heartbeat. Slow, measured, waiting. The first tremor was subtle, just a twitch beneath Alyssa's boots, easily mistaken for her own breath catching. But then came the second, deeper, sharper, and then the third, which nearly knocked her off balance. She reached out instinctively, bracing herself against the wall of the chamber. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, veins of light flickering within them like something alive was stirring just below the skin of the planet. "Zarok," she called, eyes scanning the shifting shadows. He was already on his feet, scanning his handheld module, face tight with concentration. seismic activity increasing rapidly. It's not localized, it's planetary. Before she could respond, the wind began. It poured through the narrow corridor outside the rift chamber like a scream, bending trees and lifting sand in violent swirls. The sky, once heavy with clouds, now twisted into a roiling vortex of black and crimson. Thunder cracked, not in sharp bursts, but in long, growling rolls, like the planet itself was growling in its throat. Alyssa stumbled back out of the chamber, shielding her face from a sudden downpour of dust and heat. Veyron IV wasn't just waking up, it was lashing out. "This isn't a storm," she said, breathless. "It's a reaction." Zarok stood beside her, his voice low but urgent. "The awakening isn't passive. The planet is alive, and it's defending itself." A bolt of lightning tore across the sky, not blue, but a blinding white-green. It struck the ridge not far from where they stood, blasting shards of stone into the air. Alyssa ducked, heart hammering. All around them, the ground shifted, not collapsing but flexing, as if something immense beneath the surface was beginning to move, and the planet's crust could no longer contain it. Rain began to fall, thick, warm, and oddly metallic in scent. It hissed against the ground, steaming as it hit the warm stone. Zarok pulled her toward an outcropping for cover. "We need to get off this ridge. Now." Alyssa hesitated, looking back toward the chamber. The pulsing glyphs, the machine still glowing faintly. "We leave it. For now," he said. "If we stay, we become part of the reaction." The wind howled louder, and above them, something like a spiral I formed in the storm clouds. Watching. They ran. And behind them, Veyron IV continued to tremble. The air changed. Not the way a storm shifts the sky, but deeper, denser, as if the very molecules were rearranging around them. Alyssa stopped mid-stride, just below the rise, overlooking the rift. Her hand instinctively reached for her sidearm, even though part of her knew it would be useless. She didn't know how she knew. She just felt it. Something was coming. Zarok froze beside her. His gaze was locked on the center of the rift, where a swirl of red mist and pale blue energy now coiled like steam rising from a wound in the earth. The tremors stopped. The wind died. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. Then from within the heart of the rift, a shadow moved, tall, slow, deliberate. It stepped forward, one limb at a time, not as if walking, but emerging from something deeper than space. Alyssa stared. The being was enormous, easily 3 times her height, maybe more. Its form shimmered between armor and flesh, stone and starlight. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed with twin orbs of golden white, devoid of pupils, yet somehow, watching her, it didn't speak. It simply stood there, framed by the rift, like a monument raised by time itself. Zarok took a slow step forward, arms slightly raised, not in defense, but in reverence. "It's real," he whispered. "The Guardian. I thought it was myth." The Guardian turned its head, not a mechanical motion, but smooth, almost graceful, as if it were weighing them, measuring them against a memory long buried. Alyssa tried to breathe evenly. Her training told her to run. Every nerve screamed that she was standing before something older than empires. But something deeper, more instinctual, told her to stay. The ground beneath them didn't shake anymore. But the silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Then the Guardian raised one arm. Not threatening, not hostile, simply deliberate. In its hand, a pulse of energy formed, spiraling symbols, like those from the chamber, suspended in midair between them. A challenge, or perhaps a question. Alyssa glanced at Zarok. "I don't think it's here to attack." "No," he said softly. "It's here to judge." The Guardian stood unmoving, bathed in the soft glow of symbols swirling in the air around its outstretched arm. Alyssa could feel the weight of its presence, more than physical, more than visual. It was like standing before the sum of 1,000 forgotten histories, all staring back at her. Beside her, Zarok stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. He took a deep breath and extended both palms, fingers open, then bent them into a sequence, a gesture Alyssa didn't recognize. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "Try to remember what was never taught," he murmured. The swirling glyphs responded. One brightened. Zarok began to speak, not in the clipped tones of galactic standard, nor in the smoother rhythm of his Karathi tongue, but in something older. His voice dropped into a cadence Alyssa had never heard, shaped more by breath than by sound. Each syllable felt heavy, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't moved in eons. The Guardian shifted, just slightly, its head angled, not hostile but attentive. It hurt him. A new symbol appeared in the air between them. It flickered, then held steady, then another followed. Like a response, Zarok's voice slowed, as if translating on the fly. "It's asking our purpose." Alyssa's pulse quickened. "Tell it we didn't mean to." Zarok raised a hand. "It already knows. This isn't about intent. It's about consequence." The Guardian stepped forward, not threatening, but final. The air around it shimmered with heat and energy, like the atmosphere was bending around the sheer gravity of its existence. Zarok placed a hand to his chest, then repeated the same to the Guardian, an offering of identity. "I am Zarok of Karath," he said firmly in the ancient tongue, "bearer of memory, seeker of the rift." The symbols swirled faster, converging into a shape, then collapsing into a point of light that hovered between them. The Guardian reached out and let the light settle into its palm. It turned and pointed to the southeast, toward the jagged horizon where the land dipped into shadow. "What does that mean?" Alyssa asked. Zarok's voice was tight. "It's not finished with us." The Guardian spoke then, not in voice, but as pure thought pressed directly into their minds. "The heart stirs. If you seek to undo what was broken, go there." And then, just as silently, it turned and vanished, folding back into the rift's mist, leaving only symbols still pulsing in the air. Even after the Guardian faded into mist, the presence it left behind lingered, like the air itself had memory, and that memory refused to forget. Alyssa stood in stunned silence, eyes fixed on the direction it had pointed. The horizon there was jagged and dark, a scarred valley barely visible beneath the boiling sky. But what unsettled her more than where it pointed was why. Zarok was still staring at the hovering glyphs suspended midair. They shifted slowly, reconfiguring, like gears turning inside an unseen clock. Then a final pattern emerged. A spiral, deep, complex, with branching limbs and radiant points that pulsed in sequence. Not a map, a symbol, a destination. Zarok reached toward it. The moment his fingers brushed the light, a surge of thought rushed into both their minds. Images, feelings, echoes, a pulse beneath the ground, a heart not made of flesh, but of stone, energy, and memory. A center, a secret, a choice. Then the final message came, not in voice, but as pure intention. The heart must be known, or the wound will never close. Zarok stepped back, breathing heavily. "It's giving us a task." Alyssa looked at him. "What kind of task?" He met her eyes. "A trial, not of strength, of intent." She exhaled slowly, the gravity of it all pressing down like the weight of the planet itself. "The heart of Veyron IV." Zarok nodded. "It's not just a location. It's what binds this world together. It's memory. It's pain. If we can reach it, understand it, we might be able to stop what's coming." A low rumble passed beneath their feet, subtle this time. Less a threat, more a reminder. Time was moving. "The Guardian could have destroyed us," Alyssa said, half to herself. "But it didn't. Because it's not just a protector," Zarok said. "It's a judge, and we haven't failed yet." The spiral symbol pulsed one last time, then fractured, breaking into a wave of smaller lights that drifted into the wind like scattered embers. Alyssa watched them fade into the gray sky. No orders, no videntes, just a direction and a challenge. The last echoes of the Guardian's message drifted into silence, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Alyssa looked down at her gloves, now smeared with dust and the faint glow of ancient symbols. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, a living memory waited. Not just a relic or artifact, a truth. And it was calling. Zarok adjusted the straps on his gear, then checked the mapping module. The direction it pointed, "There's a break in the terrain," he said. "A fault line that cuts straight into the southern basin." "How deep does it go?" He glanced at her. "Farther than anything we've seen. And it's unstable." Alyssa gave a tight smile. "Sounds like home." They didn't delay. The storm was already returning. Soft at first, but with a tension in the air that promised worse. They moved quickly, descending the ridge with purpose, following the faded pulse of residual energy. Every few hundred meters, new symbols would emerge in the landscape, glowing faintly from rocks, carved into the remains of ancient pathways, like breadcrumbs left by a civilization that knew someone would follow. Alyssa kept close to Zarok. The terrain grew more fractured the farther they went. Sharp ridges gave way to deep crevices, and strange, luminescent plants began at the edges of their path, glowing a pale teal against the stormy sky. "Do you think the Guardian will follow us?" she asked. Zarok shook his head. "No, this part we walk alone." Eventually, they reached a natural arch, half collapsed, covered in moss and sigils. Below it, a narrow fissure opened into darkness. Warm air rose from it, carrying the scent of stone, metal, and something ancient. Zarok stood at the edge and looked down. "This is the threshold." Alyssa joined him, peering into the shadow. "You sure this is the way?" He didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "There's only forward now." The wind picked up behind them, and for a moment, Alyssa imagined the planet itself was urging them on, not with malice, but with need. She took the first step, then Zarok followed. The darkness swallowed them both, and the rift above closed behind like a door, slowly sealing the past. The descent began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the thick, pressing quiet that filled your lungs and made every footstep sound like a drumbeat. The fissure that Alyssa and Zarok had entered narrowed behind them quickly, giving way to a long, spiraling path of stone veined with faintly glowing lines. They weren't natural. Each line pulsed, faint, rhythmic, alive. It was like following a heartbeat underground. Alyssa kept one hand on the stone wall as they moved. The rock was warm, almost pulsing beneath her fingers, as though the very planet was aware of their presence. She looked ahead at Zarok, whose eyes scanned the shifting glow ahead with quiet intensity. "How far down does this go?" she asked. "Far enough that we'll stop thinking in distance," he replied, his voice low but steady. The deeper they went, the more the walls changed. What began as raw stone soon shifted into something else. Smooth surfaces cut with precise angles, faint inscriptions etched along the edges like echoes of a forgotten language. The air smelled different too, less like earth, more like metal and electricity. Occasionally, a low vibration would ripple through the walls. Not violent, but ever-present, like the purring of something massive in sleep. It reminded Alyssa of engine cores. But this wasn't machinery. It was older, stranger. They passed beneath an arch formed by blackened crystalline structures, each one humming softly. Zarok paused, reaching out toward one of them. "Energy conduits," he murmured, "still active after all this time." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "Still waiting, you mean?" He nodded. "Everything down here is dormant, not dead." They continued, following the flow of light that grew slightly stronger the farther they walked. It twisted and curved, leading them through tight passageways and sudden openings, small chambers where ancient tech floated midair, idle and watching. None of it moved, but Alyssa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed, not with eyes, but with memory. As they rounded a bend, the space opened into a long corridor sloping downward. The floor was translucent, revealing veins of bright blue energy running underneath, like rivers beneath ice. The sight stopped them both. Zarok crouched to study it, his fingers hovering just above the surface. This isn't just power distribution. It's guidance, like the planet wants us to follow. Alyssa stared ahead, the corridor fading into golden light in the distance. "Then let's not keep it waiting." They walked slower now, not out of caution, but reverence. Each step forward felt like crossing a threshold. Time didn't feel linear here. Sound behaved strangely. Their own breathing echoed, just a little too long. Somewhere far ahead, a hum began to rise, not mechanical but melodic, layered and ancient. Not a trap, a summons. Alyssa looked over at Zarok. "Do you feel it?" she asked. "Yes," he whispered, "and it remembers us." The corridor opened with no warning. One moment, Alyssa and Zarok were walking through narrow stone paths etched with ancient lights. The next, the passage fell away, replaced by a vast, cathedral-like chamber that swallowed their footsteps in silence. Alyssa stopped in place, breath caught in her chest. Before them stretched an entire city, buried, hidden beneath the skin of Veyron IV. It was massive. Tiered platforms carved from luminous stone extended in every direction, layered like an ancient amphitheater carved into the planet's bones. Towers of glassy crystal reached upward, still glowing with a soft bioluminescence, like stars trapped in time. Roads wound between the structures in elegant spirals, etched with lines of blue energy still pulsing in rhythmic patterns. And at the heart of it all stood a spire, tall, narrow, humming with power that seemed to breathe. Alyssa whispered, "No one ever reported anything like this." Zarok stepped forward, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between awe and grief. Because it was never meant to be found. The air was different here. Not stale, not dead, but charged. Every molecule tingled against her skin, like the whole city was alive, dreaming, and had just begun to stir as they entered. As they made their way down a wide path, Alyssa noticed shapes embedded into the walls, murals, maybe, but they shifted as she walked past. Not with motion, but meaning. She blinked, and a carving of stars became a depiction of planets. Another blink and it was gone. She stopped. "Zarok, are the walls changing?" He nodded slowly. "This place doesn't just store memory. It projects it." They continued deeper, passing what looked like empty plazas and dormant machinery, though some of it still buzzed faintly when they came near, like it sensed their biology, their intent. A wide courtyard opened before them, framed by towering pillars engraved with glowing runes. As they entered, the runes brightened, casting slow ripples of light across the ground. In the center of the space was a circular pool, not filled with water, but with a swirling mist of soft golden light. It shimmered as if alive, reflecting nothing and everything at once. Alyssa approached, then hesitated. "This isn't just architecture," she said. "It's ritual." Zarok knelt at the edge of the pool, lowering his head. This was a place of convergence, where memory, energy, and intention met. She looked around again. The city didn't feel abandoned, it felt paused, as though the people who lived here hadn't vanished, but simply stepped out of time. "This isn't ruins," she said softly. "It's preservation." Zarok rose, "And we've awakened it." Above them, the spire pulsed once, bright and slow, like a heartbeat. The city was no longer asleep. They didn't see the memory at first. It began as a flicker, just a glint of movement in the corner of Alyssa's eye as they stepped through an archway. Then came the shimmer, like heat rising from stone, curling midair until form began to take shape. She stopped walking. Figures were forming in the space ahead, translucent, glowing faintly blue and gold. Not solid, not alive, but unmistakably present. Zarok exhaled slowly. Memory echoes. The figures walked along long-forgotten streets. Some carried tools, others stopped to speak, though their mouths made no sound. Tall, elegant, their features bore traces of both wisdom and weariness. These were the Dranik, the people who once thrived in this city. Alyssa stepped closer, and the images sharpened like the city wanted her to see. She saw a group of Dranik gathered around a circular platform, their hands extended toward a crystalline device. Light pulsed from it, and she felt, not heard, joy, celebration. They had completed something important. But the scene shifted quickly. The sky above them, artificial, perhaps projected onto a dome, darkened. The celebration became chaos. She saw the Dranik running, their calm turned to panic. Then came a pulse, massive, invisible, but she felt it pass through her chest like a wave. The memory skipped again. Now, the figures were fewer. They stood in a chamber much like the one she and Zarok had passed, circles of light, glyphs spiraling in the air. A single Dranik stepped forward, placing a hand on a massive console. The others bowed their heads. Zarok whispered. They sealed something away. A final flicker. The image of a swirling darkness, amorphous, impossible to define, pressed against the barrier of energy. The Dranik stood before it, hands raised in defiance, pain written across their glowing faces. Then all light vanished. The chamber went still again, as though nothing had happened. Alyssa took a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling. That wasn't a story, she said. That was a warning. Zarok nodded slowly. A warning left in memory. Passed not with words, but through feeling. Through experience. She looked around. The architecture, the glow, the hum beneath the floor, it was all part of the same living archive. This city didn't record history. It relived it. And now they had relived it too. They built all of this to hold something back, she said. No, Zarok said quietly. They built it to help the next ones understand.